This is quite possibly the biggest World War II question out there. What if the US did not use nukes on Japan?
Imagine if the US did not use the nuclear bombs on Japan in 1945. Instead, imagine it went through with the planned conventional attack on Japan on the island of Kyushu.
I'm sure he's going to talk about it, but I just think about the 3 million Purple Hearts that were built or made because they thought that 3 million soldiers were going to die.
That called for a seaborne invasion more massive than D-Day. Against the US, Imperial Japan would have rallied whatever remained of their armed forces, bolstered by thousands of kamikaze airplanes. And this invasion would have been a mere precursor for an even larger invasion that would have taken place near Tokyo 6 months later.
Oh man, this would be crazy. And then I think about all the footage and footage and from movies and television about how the Japanese were literally training their women and children to, with sticks and things like that to stab at the incoming invading American soldiers.
Codenamed Olympic and Coronet, these two plans were part of the Operation Downfall, Allied invasion of Japan. This video will assume they actually happened.
What's also scary about this situation is the Soviets were moving into what was at that time known as Manchukuo or Manchuria, so the Soviets probably would have done their own invasion, splitting up the Japanese islands, assuming we'd see Japanese islands, half of it being communist, the other half being democratic. Basically imagine a Korean peninsula, but on Japan. That's how this could have played out.
By 1945, Imperial Japan was on the brink of defeat. Despite this, its leaders were unwilling to surrender.
I mean, I can kind of see it from their perspective slightly, not to put myself in the shoes of Hirohito or a crazy Japanese general, but why not just, say you're going to fight till the very last woman and child to try to just get, both sides to wipe peace with you. And maybe you get to retain some of your Japanese empire that you kept. Maybe you get to keep some of the islands or some of the areas in China. They probably weren't going to keep that, but at least the Korean peninsula.
As the Allied forces pushed towards the home islands, Japanese resistance became more fierce and desperate. In February 1945, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, 21,000 heavily fortified Japanese troops resisted attacks of 3 US Marine divisions for 5 weeks. Only 216 Japanese soldiers were captured alive.
You know what I think about this? You know how many people you can go around talking to nowadays? Just walk on the street and ask, did your grandfather or your great-grandfather fight in World War II? Do you know how people say yes? It's crazy because we would be living in such a different America right now if we did actually have to invade the Japanese islands, because we would have lost, what the U.S. Army thought, or the U.S. military thought. Do you know the downfall effect? That's funny because it's called Operation Downfall. Do you know what that would have done for an entire generation? Well, multiple generations obviously would have been lost by now, but an entire generation would have been lost. Like, we would be living in such a different America at this point here in 2025.
An even bloodier Battle of Okinawa followed in April. For 3 months, 7 US divisions battled 3 Japanese divisions, several brigades, and almost 40,000 conscripted island civilians. While Americans lost some 20,000 soldiers, the Japanese lost over 100,000. Taking into account these battles, the US command began discussing the best way to end the war. Even in the real timeline, the atom bomb was not known to the commanders, as the Manhattan Project was still a closely guarded secret.
Yeah, and so if I haven't made it really obvious right now with my first beginning talks of this, I think that that was probably the best option, to use the atom bomb in our timeline. I know that's controversial in certain parts of the internet, but I do think that for the most part, most historians are just like, I mean, there's an argument to be made if we needed to drop it or drop the second one. That's an argument, but if it comes down to just nuke Japan or literally invade and possibly have 3 million American soldiers and then countless Japanese lives lost, I think most people that don't just go on Twitter yelling at people for random reasons, that do actually study history, most people generally pick the atom bomb. But things do get more complicated once you get into the nitty-gritty of the whole thing. Basically, when the Japanese were down to surrender, and if we actually needed to use the bomb, some people were saying that Japan was maybe already going to surrender. We didn't even need to go and blow up Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
The United States Navy wanted to avoid further kamikaze attacks by focusing on a naval blockade, further starving Japan of resources. In addition, Allies would have continued a bombing campaign that would have destroyed whatever remained of the country's industrial capacity. But the army chiefs opposed this. They believed such an approach would merely prolong the war and risk lowering morale back home. Their viewpoint prevailed, even though there was a reasonable possibility seaborne invasion might turn into, as US President Harry Truman put it, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. The result was Operation Downfall. Invading Japan presented the Allies with many challenges.
Mind you, here's another crazy argument that I always think about. We don't use the nukes. We actually go in and invade the Japanese mainland. Let's say that scenario does play out. Like I mentioned just a little bit earlier, that's going to take us significantly longer to kick the Japanese out of the war. If we have to drive our troops all the way up to take the capital, Tokyo, here at this point. If by that point, like I said, the communists are going to launch their own invasion. I mean, they're already going in through Manchukuo here. They're probably going to take all of the Korean Peninsula. They might even try to get revenge on the whole Russo-Japanese War that just happened a couple decades prior. That might have definitely happened. I imagine a world where if we invade the Japanese, we're going to get the southern half of these islands, and the Soviets are going to get the northern half. Obviously, you would definitely want the southern half of Japan more than the northern half. We have a lot more economic development down here than they do. Might be a Korean Peninsula sort of thing, but Japan would be ruined right now. I mean, if Japan had to go through what the Korean Peninsula is still going through, or what Germany went through during the entirety of the Cold War, look at Germany is still not the same country. Like, Germany is still recovering. If you look at maps under the surface, like East Germany and West Germany, drastically different places. For the most part, Germany's doing pretty well for itself, but it's kind of tough. And obviously, we all know the story of the Korean Peninsula. It still hasn't recovered. It's still a complete mess over there. So imagine that, but on Japan as well.
Japanese islands are far from other large land masses, meaning the invasion fleet would need to cross longer distances. Certainly much longer than the Normandy assault fleet had to.
You're telling me. It is so much, yeah, I mean, can't you even see, well, maybe not from this position, but can't you see French mainland or the British Isles on a clear enough day at the shortest point here?
Your distance also means longer time needed to bring
Maybe
in
almost
reinforcements using the same ships or added supplies.
Yeah, so we had the Philippines obviously at this point. That was an American colony still currently.
The annual typhoon season could also potentially wreck any invasion fleet. Due to Japan's rocky coastline, there weren't many places suitable for a seaborne assault like D-Day landings in Normandy in.
And do not count out the Japanese control over natural disasters, because it happened to the Mongolian Empire twice. Literally twice. Isn't that where the word kamikaze comes from? Is it actually adopted because of what happened to the divine winds that stopped not one, but two different massive Mongol invasions that was going to take over the Japanese islands?
1944.
So something tells me maybe there could have been a crazy typhoon that could have all of a sudden hit all those American troops trying to invade these islands.
Japanese commanders knew all this. They correctly assumed Allies would target the island of Kyushu and then the beaches of the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. Moreover, they knew their military couldn't defeat the Allies. Commanders could merely hope to slow down the invasion in a colossal battle of attrition.
That's like their military doctrine, I heard, for the entirety of World War II. Back in 1941, before they even did Pearl Harbor, they knew that they didn't have a chance against just the U.S. I mean, they definitely respected the U.S. You know, they definitely didn't look down on the U.S. They knew that they had to kind of like really quick jab us out of the war, boom, boom. That's what they thought the Pearl Harbor attack was going to be. Cripple us enough just to delay it, because they knew that over time the Japanese were not going to be able to defeat the U.S.
If Japanese forces managed to hurt the Allies badly enough, they might be willing to negotiate a more favorable peace treaty. Japan began reinforcing defenses on Kyushu. In April 1945, Allied intelligence suggested there were around 350,000 soldiers on the island. By August, estimates rose to at least 545,000. The fact was, Japan placed even more combatants there, transferring forces not only from other parts of the country, but from Korea and Manchuria too. Estimates of the number of Japanese aircraft also rose over the months, as Japan poured in most of their air forces near Kyushu.
Wow.
Japan deliberately saved its remaining warplanes for one last stand.
Dang, so they were ready for it. Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, the Japanese are not at all aware of the Manhattan Project at this time, or at all aware that we are literally building a bomb that has the power of the sun to completely obliterate the city. So they are expecting fully a naval invasion, a D-Day type invasion onto their islands. So I would not be surprised if they didn't have their own tons and tons and tons of surprises ready for us when we actually came there.
In addition, armed forces repurposed many planes for suicide attacks. While the Japanese Imperial Navy lacked fuel for any significant operations, it nevertheless planned to utilize its capital ships to defend ports and naval bases, despite being dwarfed by the US fleet.
Yeah, at this point, I mean, they had been that fleet had been grinded down heavily by 1945.
Had its kamikaze units too, like the trained units of suicide divers, at least 100 Kaiten manned torpedoes, and over 2,400 Shinyo suicide motorboats. Operation Downfall would have consisted of 2 naval invasions, Olympic and Coronet. Each of those would have dwarfed the 1944 Normandy landings in Europe. In addition, to distract Japanese forces, Allies planned a diversion codenamed Pastel. Its objective would have been to try to fool Japanese commanders into believing Allies were interested in conquering ports around Japan, like on the island of Taiwan, to secure new airfields for their bomber planes. The principal actor of this plan was the fictitious 35th Airborne Corps. Olympic was the planned invasion of the Japanese home island of Kyushu, set for early November 1945. Allied forces would have landed in the southern part of the island.
Yeah, remember that Japan is extremely mountainous. We're not fighting on like open plains like we were for the most part in the European theater, or through even forests. I mean, you're talking about driving through a massive mountain range that spines through all of the Japanese islands.
Near Miyazaki, Ariake, and Kushikino. Allies would have invaded Kyushu using 6 infantry divisions and 3 marine divisions on day 1. Further 3 divisions were to take the nearby islands, so those could provide easier service for the invasion.
I mean, no matter, just from both sides, this is just a terrifying plan. Like, this is just for both the Japanese and for the USA. It's just the amount of lives lost is going to be insane for this.
Another 2 divisions were to go for the smaller home island of Shikoku in hope of a diversion. For comparison, Normandy landing saw 7 divisions land on the beaches in addition to 3 airborne divisions, which were of smaller size. According to US Navy shipping estimates, the assault echelon would have incorporated over 436,000 people, of which 315,000 would have been combat troops. 71,000 vehicles would also be disembarked, of which 43,000 would be combat ones.
I really wonder how much... I would argue that like Japan wouldn't even be the same today if it actually had to go through this sort of land invasion. There are people, for the most part, well, I mean, it depends, because you obviously have some of the fire bombings of Tokyo, and obviously the people that were affected by the atoms bombs themselves, but a lot of the Japanese people were able to avoid any sort of direct impact with the war. I mean, that's part of the reason why the U.S. was just, setting ablaze their fire because, or, their cities, because they knew a lot of the Japanese people, like if you were just a woman in the Japanese countryside, you got to avoid a lot of the chaos. Obviously, you cannot say the same thing for, the women in Korea or pretty much anybody else surrounding Japan. I mean, that is literally 101. That you could not say anything like China was in chaos because of Japan, the Korean Peninsula, the Philippines, down to Indonesia, the Australians. I mean, Japan was absolutely brutal.
And none of that includes the later follow-up forces. It's unclear just how many troops of that assault echelon would have attempted to land on Kyushu itself on the very first day, but it's likely upward of 160 or even 170,000 troops.
But something tells me the soul of Japan could have taken a bad turn if it went through this invasion and every single city and town on all the Japanese islands had to go and face this. I mean, damn, I can't imagine. I do believe we'd be experiencing just a different Japan. I'm not saying that they wouldn't. I don't know what Japan of 2025 that had to deal with Operation Downfall would look like today, but I can just say it would for sure be different.
For comparison, the first day wave of the D-Day invasion included 156,000 troops. Of course, Olympic also had some 80,000 further troops going for those other nearby islands. At Normandy, by the 5th day of the invasion, Allies landed around 320.
That is so many military equipment. That's so much military equipment. That is crazy. This is, I don't know why I've never seen this footage.
26,000 troops and over 54,000 vehicles.
That's
Proportionally
so much.
speaking, additional troops and equipment for operation
Look at that massive American industrial power, baby. That is our specialty right there. We just build things and we just don't stop.
Olympic would have been more scarce. There simply weren't enough ships and the distances to big staging areas were too great. Around 6 more divisions were prepped as later reinforcements. Most of the second echelon forces were various command and support troops. It would have taken weeks and months for all those forces to arrive.
Jeez.
Indeed, US Army-owned plans suggest that by the 30th day of the invasion,
So that was just D-Day. I mean, like he was pointing out, like this is so much bigger and so much more stuff that they would have to transport from, I mean, it's a little bit more troops from the first Olympic landings, only a couple thousand more troops, but damn, it's so much further to have to travel.
there would be enough ships and planes available to raise the overall personnel total on Kyushu to only 570,000. 75 days after Invasion Day, the overall transported total was to reach 767,000.
Oh my goodness, almost 3/4 of the way to 1 million troops in the southern part of Japan right now.
In Normandy, it took 50 days to disembark 1.4 million personnel.
So it's a little bit easier, obviously, but you know, you have your ally, the UK there, it's going to be a lot easier.
The margins for
Who do we got here? I mean, I guess we can land some of the... I think that this is light blue because they are showing that China could have acted as a landing strip briefly for a lot of American troops and equipment. We could have landed somewhere here, but remember, this is an active war zone at this time. I mean, China has been actively fighting the Japanese for like a decade now, at least.
error and reinforcements were clearly much smaller for this opening stage of the Operation Downfall. The naval fleet supporting Olympic would have been much bigger though, to partly compensate for it. Of course, the air power provided the most fire support in Normandy. Aircraft carriers would be important for Olympic, as there's no landmass such as Britain close enough to house thousands of tactical planes.
That's literally what I was just talking about right now. I mean, maybe China, but that seems a little bit difficult. Again, that's an active war zone and it's being fought army versus army.
For Olympic, more bombers were planned, which had enough range to Japan.
It's not like, you know, the UK and the British Isles, where the British Isles was pretty safe. Like, there wasn't an active army fighting. The Germans were not actively fighting on the British Isles.
All in all, Allied air forces would have included some 10,000 airplanes of various kinds, and for various purposes. In this aspect, at least, D-Day was comparable to the Olympic. As colossal as Olympic was, it is important to stress its goal was merely to secure the southern half of Kyushu. This would become one of the staging areas for Karnet.
They didn't even want the full island. They just wanted the southern half of this. That way they could do from their operation, after Operation Olympic, they go straight for Tokyo.
An even more massive seaborne invasion targeting the heart of the Empire of Japan. That was tentatively planned for March 1946. Karnet would have used 2 key lines.
So this would have lasted another additional... Because Japan surrenders in August 1945, if I remember correctly. So the war would have lasted an additional like 9 months.
Landing areas: Hirutsaka on Sagami Bay to the west of Tokyo Bay, and Kujikuri Beach on the Boso Peninsula to the east of Tokyo Bay. The forces landing on these 2 locations would then press inland, encircling Tokyo and pushing across the Kanto Plain towards the city of Nagano.
Oh man.
The 8th Army would have landed in the west.
I just can't, I'm just like sick. Like thinking about this is actually crazy. This would have been absolutely insane.
It would have included 9 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions. The 1st Army would have attacked in the east with another 6 infantry divisions and 3 marine divisions. Overall, Allied plans for the initial...
I mean, remember, this is assuming that everything's just going to go swimmingly, kind of, which there's definitely a good chance that maybe it wouldn't. Maybe one of these invasions ended in disaster. I mean, D-Day was obviously successful for the Allies, but who's to say that this Operation Olympic would be successful? It'd be a very, very different situation. I mean, like he was just mentioning, again, like the proximity the British Isles has to the mainland European continent is so much shorter than this distance here.
Assault included over 500,000 soldiers in various services and around 74,000 vehicles. US forces would have carried out most of these operations, but their allies would have contributed as well.
I was going to say, we're going to need the Brits over there. I mean, we need something. And then by this point, Europe is all cleaned up, obviously, by March 1946. Damn. By March 46, are we sending in Germans? Can you imagine that, bro? Imagine if we are already using those Germans. I mean, we had no problem using those Germans and getting them ready for... Well, actually, there was a time where we didn't want to use the German soldiers because that would have been a bad look. But we had no problem using their scientists for Operation Paperclip. But imagine some of the Germans get sent over here to Tokyo, says, hey, here you go, fight your ally. They're actually not Aryan. You got to go after them.
The entire British Pacific Fleet was to take part in operations too. In addition, there were plans to bolster US forces with at least 5 divisions of Australian, British, Canadian...
We're going to need the British absolutely on our side to be able to do this. Man, I really wonder, like, how much differently does the world play out in this universe? I mean, obviously, we'd still enter a Cold War, but... I mean, dang, the British Empire is going to be heavily affected. Does the British Empire collapse way sooner, or do we not let it collapse? Or what if, what if the rest of the world plays out differently throughout the Cold War? But let's get through this first.
And New Zealand troops.
Yeah, Australia and New Zealand are going to have to play massive roles. I mean, because they're the closest to it, technically, out of the British Empire. I mean, besides, like, well, British Raj too. But Hong Kong is over there. Didn't Hong Kong get taken over by the Japanese at this point, or do we take that back?
The Allies considered using poisonous gases in Japan at least since 1944.
Bruh.
By the mid-1945, Chemical Warfare Service presented a more detailed plan.
I mean, hey, it was all on the table, obviously, at that point. I mean, remember the Japanese plan to sail a submarine that had the Black Death on it into San Diego, in hopes that it would start a plague and destroy us from the inside. I mean, everything was opened. Let's not forget Japan was not above doing this as well. Japan would have absolutely done the same thing to us if they thought that it was going to help them win the battle. It's unfortunate that that was even thought about by the American higher-ups, though. You would think that we wouldn't stoop to that level, but apparently that was the case.
Strategic bombers could have struck targets across Japan, starting with Tokyo. Up to 56,000 tons of gas bombs.
Oh yeah, Tokyo is being burnt to the ground. Complete rubble. Look at the way Germany was destroyed. Look at the way massive German cities were destroyed. I mean, so much of Japan was saved. Obviously not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but Tokyo definitely was, because there wasn't this massive land invasion. I mean, Tokyo got messed up too, don't get me wrong, because there were other air raids. There were other ways that we destroyed Japanese cities besides just the nukes.
Have been dropped over cities in the weeks before the invasion. The plan estimated poisonous gas might kill up to 5 million Japanese citizens.
Bro,
however, US President Truman vetoed this idea.
Okay, that's good. They're okay, Truman. All right, there you go. This reminded me randomly of when Truman was like clowning on Oppenheimer for his like massive guilt or whatever. I mean, I knew about that before I watched the movie. A lot of you guys probably remember that scene from the movie, but Truman didn't give a crap what Oppenheimer thought. He was just like, what do you call him? A leech, a cockroach, something like that. He's just like, I was the one that dropped the bomb. I gave the decision. You don't need to worry about it.
Warfare was unpopular both at home and abroad. Furthermore, it would have likely triggered retaliation by Japan using its reserves of poisonous gas, as it did in China in the late 1930s. Using poisonous chemicals against...
Whoa, what was that?
It would have likely triggered retaliation by Japan using its reserves of poisonous gas, as it did in China in the late 1930s.
Again, I mean, I hope that everyone that's watching my videos right now already knows the horrors that was the Japanese Empire, because I feel like I've talked about it a long time, and more than likely you like history if you are watching this video right now, but it's scary to me how many people think that Japan at this time was still just the Uwu Empire, and just like this cute little anime girl. They've done such a good job at just kind of, ignoring that dark history. Now, I will say if you're in Asia, they don't forget, But a lot of people in the West forget. A lot of Europeans and Americans they don't even know what happened and the horrific things the Japanese Empire did during World War II.
Using poisonous chemicals against Japanese crops to make the famine worse was not off the table though.
Damn.
So what would have happened if Operation Downfall was realized? In a word, a bloodbath. After Okinawa and Iwo Jima, Allied analysts knew Japanese resistance would be fierce and desperate. The terrain on Kyushu was similar to the Okinawa one, and favorable to defenders, hilly and full of ravines. The Japanese had ample time to construct a network of caves and bunkers, while the US would use it.
I'm really liking this a lot to kind of the Vietnam War, to be quite honest with you. I mean, there are already some similarities between Japan and Vietnam, but I think this would be the Vietnam War on steroids. Arguably, probably worse. And remember, the U.S. didn't win the Vietnam War. So if it's any worse than the Vietnam War, then we ain't gonna win. I think the U.S. probably would find a way to get it done. This is a very different time period in the U.S.'s history in the 1940s. 46, very, very different time than 66 or 67 or 1968 and all that stuff. The American public, yeah, just different mindset and things like that. I think the U.S. probably would have still got it done, but I don't know. It's hard to say.
Its ample firepower to suppress the defenders initially, the US own landing ships would inevitably get attacked. The US initially thought Japan could not use more than 800 planes in kamikaze attacks. Those estimates then
Didn't he say 5,000?
Rising. By August, the US estimated 3,900 kamikaze repurposed planes. Years after the war, it was revealed
6,000, there it is.
Japan had in fact prepared an even bigger kamikaze force. At Okinawa...
Well, there you go. We were not correct. We didn't have the right estimates. And, yep, that's not good. So they would have messed us up.
The Japanese used 1,500 kamikaze planes and achieved a decent success. Furthermore, those attacks were mostly directed against combat ships. For the defense of the homeland, as it was the last big stand, the Japanese planned to attack only the landing ships, which would be easier targets. They would be closer, slower, and basically without defenses. Flying over land to reach the beaches would also largely negate the radar warning advantage the US had at Okinawa. Japanese own estimates varied from 15 to 50% of the US landing fleet neutralized.
Damn, did he miss that, or did they neutralize it before he hit?
Even if those were wishful thinking, it's plausible the US would have lost hundreds of various landing ships and craft. And
you got to consider, the domino effect of this would be crazy. Like, we lose this many troops and this much men and this much naval power. What do you think happens to the Cold War after that? Don't you think this, because the Soviets are there and they're observing extremely, extremely closely. If the U.S. is weakened heavily enough in Operation Downfall, maybe they start thinking like, you know what? Screw it. Let's go ahead and invade Europe. We're just going to go ahead and try to take all of Germany and all of France. The other thing you got to remember is if we don't use the nukes on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, does the world fully realize the horror of these devices, of these weapons of mass destruction? I don't think it does. I really don't. Like, I think that, unfortunately, the world had to see the horrors it could cause before they were able to realize, like, oh my God, we should never, ever, ever use these ever again if we don't have to. You needed to put the fear of God in humanity, of what we created, and I think that if we didn't use them, then who knows? The Soviets get a nuke in 1949 still, and maybe they're much more lenient in pulling that trigger and being like, you know what? Let's just see what happens. Let's go ahead and drop this on London or Paris or maybe even DC if they could get it over there. I don't know if they could do that in the 40s, but eventually.
Ends upon tens of thousands of US troops with them. Another comparison with Normandy is in order. The Luftwaffe had some 500 combat planes available in theater against almost 10,000 Allied planes. The US estimate of Japanese air forces was always lagging behind. Including kamikaze repurposed planes, the Japanese had some 11,000 combat aircraft ready. US estimates of Japanese ground forces were equally flawed initially and kept rising through 1945. While in March of 1945 there was just one division on Kyushu, the Japanese correctly estimated that Kyushu was indeed the most plausible point where the US attack might succeed, due to its relative proximity to other US-held islands. A massive force was assembled, and by August 1945, the Japanese force on Kyushu numbered 14 divisions. Overall military personnel on Kyushu, including Navy and Air Force, numbered 735,000. By November, when Olympic was to start, the Japanese defense plan, codenamed Ketsugo, called for 900,000 troops on Kyushu.
Oh my
Japanese forces on the home islands included over 4.3 million troops. Of course, all those forces were by 1945 very short on equipment and especially on ammo.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Indeed, out of 65 divisions on paper, only 40 actually had equipment, and only 30 actually had nominal amounts of ammo. While such woefully undersupplied forces would have met the US invasion in Operation Coronet near Tokyo, for Operation Olympic the Japanese forces were still fairly well supplied.
You gotta remember, I mean, the Japanese had that spirit. They don't, I would still say they would be, you know, obviously brutal fighters, brutal warriors, even if they didn't have equipment. They would figure it out. That was a thing. I mean, they were very, like, they played very well with the lack of resources. Don't forget their, like, bike invasion of, I believe it was Malaysia, when they just didn't want to use, or they didn't have the opportunity to use a lot of motorized vehicles, so they just took an entire country over because of bikes. Like, the Japanese people were very, very resourceful. They would have figured out, whether they have ammo or not, ways to definitely get heavy casualties.
But commanders also considered skipping Olympic altogether and focusing on Coronet.
Imagine just going balls deep, don't get a single landing anywhere else in Japan, just going straight after Tokyo. That would be a crazy move. What a crazy gamble.
Could have initially isolated a third of the Japanese army troops stuck on Kyushu. However, that would have caused the Allies air support, except for the long-range bombers and airplanes aboard the aircraft carriers. Ship resupply route would have also been longer. The Allied force would have eventually been met with an even larger Japanese force near Tokyo. Of the two bad options, it was likely a worse one. The weather would have also worked against the Allies. Olympic was set to begin in October 1945. On October 9th, the Typhoon Louise struck the Allied staging area on Okinawa.
That's crazy. That is crazy. We don't talk about this because this is post-World War II. World War II is officially over by October 1945, and the Dacia Typhoon hit us afterwards when this was supposed to be the landing point for hundreds of thousands of troops and equipment. That's crazy.
Historically, the Typhoon Louise sank 2 US ships, wrecked 32, and stranded another 222 ships.
Bro, it was like the universe prepared again. The divine winds prepared again to save the Japanese islands. They've done it in the past. They would have done it again. That's crazy. Except in this timeline, we're the Mongolian Empire. America is Truman, I guess, is Genghis Khan.
Olympic took place according to the pre-established timeline. This typhoon would have wrecked many Allied ships and caused supply issues in the invasion of Kyushu.
That's insane.
Another typhoon would have influenced Operation Coronet. Typhoon Barbara struck the northern Philippines on April 4th, 1946. This was one of the main staging areas for both Olympic and later Coronet.
I mean, that's going to be the safest area. Obviously, the U.S. is going to probably need to use the Philippines heavily in the event that we actually do Operation Downfall.
The sea would have been teeming with Allied ships on their way to Japan. Historically, Typhoon Barbara inflicted only moderate damage, but it is difficult to estimate its possible effects on the invasion forces.
Yeah, which is more stuff
So, if Operation Downfall went as originally planned, the Allied forces would have plausibly lost tens of thousands or even 100,000 troops before those even touched Kyushu, due to kamikaze, Japanese air forces, submarines, mines, and a hurricane. Still, the US would have no option but to press on, pouring their troops onto the southern part of the island. But its geography and concentration of forces would likely lead to Okinawa-type warfare, only with casualties much higher for both sides. US intelligence casualty estimates had a wide range of figures. Initial ones came when the US thought the Japanese had put forth a far smaller force in Kyushu. US Admiral Leahy feared almost 270,000 US casualties on Kyushu. MacArthur's staff revised their casualty estimate in July to possibly as many as
I thought it was 3 million, but this is talking about just the southern island.
280,000 dead or wounded Americans. Using Okinawa as a benchmark, the figures are even bloodier. On Okinawa, the Japanese had almost 10 times fewer troops than they would have on Kyushu. Unlike on Kyushu, where the Japanese would outnumber the US by a few times, on Okinawa it was the US which outnumbered the Japanese by a few times, and enjoyed an even greater fire support edge, relatively speaking, than the US would enjoy on Kyushu. Yet the US still suffered 20,000 dead and 55,000 wounded. So
It's crazy. So this would be on a whole nother level right here.
An extrapolated number for Operation Olympic may lead to over 200,000 US troops dead, not counting those lost before a successful landing. It's clear that Operation Olympic would have ended with far more dead than anyone dared initially imagine, and it would require much bigger reinforcement troops sent to the area. While the Japanese forces lacked mobility and fire support, making them unlikely to regain land on Kyushu, it's plausible that Operation Coronet would have to be postponed, as more and more US troops would hastily be sent into the grinder.
Yeah, this could be really the thing that drives down the American public's interest in continuing the war. I mean, maybe the Japanese, this might be the best thing ever for the Japanese Empire. Maybe they could get the Americans just to give them a more favorable peace option. They were going to lose. No, don't get me wrong. The Japanese Empire was going to lose, but they might not have had to give up that unconditional surrender.
Securing southern Kyushu might take months longer, and then further months until the US recuperates from such a bloody battle, until fresh troops are prepped and the US landing fleet is partially rebuilt.
What's scary is I mentioned, because he's not mentioning the communists at all, the Soviet Union at all. So I just wonder, like, okay, maybe there is a timeline, which there probably would be. The U.S. would probably think, okay, we have to knock the Japanese out of the war by this certain date, probably July, summer 1946 or something like that, before the communists start getting their own forces over there and doing their own invasion of Japan. And I wonder if that desperation coming out of America just makes everything 10 times worse. We sacrifice way more men because we think that the countdown is coming, the clock is ticking. We got to get them out before the communists come over there. And remember, that's the whole point of the D-Day invasion. That's the whole point of going into the European theater. Like the Americans, the French, the British all had to get a beachhead. They needed to get a front line going to take over continental Europe before the communists roll in and take everything.
That could take additional months or even a year. Once the southern part of Kyushu would be secured, the US would also station thousands of planes there, aiding in a later invasion near Tokyo. Given that the Japanese would have used up pretty much all their kamikaze planes and air power, and given that supply problems and ammo scarcity would have been even worse for Japan, it's likely that the second invasion would see fewer casualties for the US. Japan was also quite low on food by that point, and simply waiting out the Japanese might lower the fighting effectiveness of a large standing army around Tokyo. But still, given months and months of protracted warfare, total casualties would likely be massive. A Secretary of War study by William Shockley estimated that the entire invasion of Japan would result in 400 to 800,000
Yeah, so I had heard 3 million. That's why I keep throwing around that number.
Oh,
that's 3 million wounded.
Dead US troops. For the Japanese, the figures would be far worse.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine what the Japanese figures would be.
Besides the armed forces, Japan had the volunteer fighting corps. Basically, all healthy men and women of a certain age
2
were
million,
to fight.
3 million?
Of course, they had little or no
4?
training and were expected to fight using whatever means necessary, including knives, wooden spears, and so on. The US estimated 5 to 10 million.
Damn! I was gonna say 5 to 10, but I thought it was a little bit ridiculous. So I reeled my numbers back, but that's another aspect that people forget. You know, they don't think about the when it comes to, well, maybe the U.S. just should have actually invaded the Japanese islands. They only throw out the figures that the American figures lost. But 5 to 10 million is game-changing for Japan. Remember that currently in 2025, this is 80 years later, Japan's only hovering around 100 million, or is it 130 million? Somewhere around there, I think 100 million. So, and again, you have to think of the downward effects, like I mentioned earlier. This is 3 or 4 generations ago. So all of those people don't have kids, and Japan's already facing a massive depopulation crisis over there, so I'm sure this would have made it 10 times worse.
And Japanese would die.
I don't even know if we see Japan have an economic boom as they did in the 80s if they lose this many people. They lose 10 million Japanese people. I don't know if you can say they have like such a massive economic boom in the 80s. It's crazy.
All that, one might think that the US would simply hesitate to invade Japan in the first place. But in this alternate scenario where nuclear bombs are not an option, it would be very hard to force Japan to capitulate any other way. Even with the ever-growing casualty estimates, some US commanders at the time still thought the invasion should go forward, including General MacArthur, who was the supreme commander of the US ground troops and air forces in the Pacific. US Admiral Nimitz, however, who commanded the US Pacific Fleet, thought the invasion was too risky. Thing is, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan as well.
There we go. We had to mention it.
And attacked Japanese-held Manchuria. In reality, that happened on August 9th, but it's plausible that date might change in an alternate reality where the US doesn't drop the atomic bomb. That campaign was quite swift, and Russians also used smaller forces to take Sakhalin Island and Kuril Islands from Japan. Without the atomic bombs and swift Japanese surrender, it's quite plausible there would be extra pressure on the US generals.
This is literally what I was mentioning, because I believe this, how do you pronounce this? It's Anu Island, the northernmost island. That might have been a little bit easier to invade for the Soviets. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to say what the type of stuff the Soviets had ready to go, but it might have been easier to launch it. Probably. I mean, they're just right there. Mind you, obviously, most of the Soviet capacity and resources and all that stuff is in the West, but this is Soviet territory. This is the island they got to get to. Slightly more achievable, it seems like, at least on it from a map perspective,
to go through with the invasion of Japan, so they would force it to capitulate as early as possible, before the Soviet Union took too much of the ex-Japanese territory.
Thank God he mentioned this, because this has to be mentioned. This is 100% a big thing that's going on in all the generals' minds at this time, if we actually have to land boots on the ground in Japan, is it's a race against the Soviets. Because Europe was a race against the Soviets, and Japan might end up being another race against the Soviets.
Or before they try to invade Hokkaido, for example.
Hokkaido, my bad. I thought that was called... Am I thinking of the people, the ethnicity group that live here? The AINU or something? ANU?
Well, it would take Soviets quite some time to assemble a fleet for taking Hokkaido.
Yeah, I do agree, because didn't it take... Remember the Russo-Japanese War? It took their fleet like 6 months to get there? From like the Baltic Sea Fleet all the way over, and then right when they got there, they got a massive black eye and they all got blown up.
It's plausible the US would rush in, despite the casualties, and take the Kanto Plain around Tokyo sometime before the end of 1946.
That's exactly what I just said. That's crazy.
Completely worn out and without a remaining army or industry, Japan would most likely ultimately surrender. The human cost,
but it's just far, far worse for everybody involved,
however, would have been staggering.
Yeah, the human cost would have been staggering. I mean, that's to say the least. As for what would happen to Japan after Operation Downfall, just think a cross between post-war German/Austria and the Korean Peninsula after the Korean War. Plus, most of Japan would be under the Western Allies, whereas Hokkaido is under the Soviets, in addition to all of Korea, potentially China being communist as well. And see, this guy's really thinking about the overarching impact it would have made for the immediate Cold War afterwards. It's a scary thought. Anyways, Binkoff's Battlefield, I thought he did a great job of showing just the true horrors of how bad this could have been. Big thanks to my patrons this month. The Jewish Autonomous Oblast only has 0.6% of Jewish population left. It's pronounced Tour de Siyazdru. Whitegrape of the Pirates. Samuel Walker. LoreTrack. William. Scientific Soulist. Nolan. NordTyrol. Miglu the Goat. KingBearHaze. Connor Pavlik. Fredrik Tibblin. Never change, Drew, unless you want to. LuxembourgLover.